Okay, let's dive deep today. We're unpacking a story that's, well, it's way more than just a business case study. It's really a narrative about building something truly global and doing it by placing the human element right slap bang in the center.
Absolutely. Our source material today, it paints this really compelling picture of Howard Schultz. He's someone who, by his own account, wasn't just aiming to sell coffee.
No, not at all. He was talking about cultivating hope, restoring dignity, forging connections. It's quite something.
It really is. And his journey, I mean, from public housing projects in Brooklyn all the way to leading one of the planet's most recognized brands. It's a powerful argument, isn't it? That leading with genuine humanity can actually build massive empires.
It definitely challenges some assumptions. So, welcome everyone to this deep dive. We're really zeroing in today on the insights we can pull from the source material you provided, focusing squarely on the leadership of Howard Schultz.
And these sources, they really dig into his habits, his core philosophy, and those specific, sometimes quite counterintuitive decisions that fundamentally changed Starbucks.
Yeah, transformed it from that small Seattle company just selling beans
Right, just beans back then.
into this global symbol of community. And, well, a significant voice, sometimes controversially, in corporate responsibility.
For sure.
So, our mission today, let's try and extract the most crucial bits of knowledge from all this. How did that relentless people-first approach translate into such massive, enduring success and global impact? And maybe more importantly, what can you listening take away from his unique and often pretty challenging path?
What I find really fascinating about the sources on Schultz is how vividly they connect his earliest life experiences directly to his later corporate thinking. It's not just background info, it's presented as the very foundation, the sort of crucible where his leadership style was forged.
You really get that sense.
Yeah, they make it pretty clear that his understanding of the world wasn't formed in boardrooms or, business school classes. It came from the sometimes pretty harsh reality of working class Brooklyn.
That connection is so clear throughout the material, isn't it? And that's really where our deep dive has to start, right at the beginning. Peeling back those layers, let's call this section maybe, From Brooklyn Grit to a Global Vision, the Foundation of Empathy.
Good title.
Howard Schultz, born 1953, grew up in Canarsie, Brooklyn. The sources consistently describe this place, emphasizing its working-class roots, that sense of community that comes from shared struggle, but also, frankly, the real lack of economic opportunity for a lot of people there.
Definitely. He spent his formative years in public housing, small apartment, crowded, with his parents and siblings. His father, as the sources describe, had those kinds of typical blue-collar jobs back then, truck driver, factory worker.
Jobs that demanded a lot physically but offered very little security, right? Left families feeling pretty vulnerable all the time.
Exactly. And that instability wasn't just an idea for the Schultz family. It became this really defining, visceral thing. When Howard was only 7, his father broke his ankle, a serious injury.
And today you'd may think, okay, workers' comp, safety nets.
Right. But the sources paint a starkly different picture for that time and place. The consequences were immediate and they were devastating. That broken ankle wasn't just about the physical pain. It meant his father lost his job instantly.
Just like that.
Just like that. The family's only income gone, and critically, their health insurance vanished too.
Wow. Imagine being 7 years old and watching that happen. Your dad, the provider, just brought low. Not just by the injury itself, but by the system sort of pulling the rug out from under the whole family.
The sources really emphasize how deeply that specific moment hit young Howard. It gave him this stark understanding of just how fragile working-class life could be, how precarious everything felt.
And more than just fragility, right? A sense of unfairness.
Absolutely. A profound feeling of injustice. Why should someone who works hard, gets injured doing their job, suddenly lose everything? That question, that feeling, the sources suggest it just became embedded in him, something he carried forward.
And you can totally see how that early perspective is crucial. Because, like the sources show, it fundamentally shaped how he viewed the employer-employee dynamic years later when he was the one in charge.
It wasn't just numbers on a spreadsheet for him. It was about seeing the humanity, the vulnerability, the dignity of the people who relied on the company. He knew what that felt like.
Breaking out of that expected path wasn't easy either. The sources mention his perseverance being the first in his family to even attend college.
Yeah, and he managed that through football scholarship to Northern Michigan University, which says a lot about his drive, his ability to overcome the odds stacked against him.
So he gets through college, starts his career, first in sales, actually, of Xerox, which the sources say gave him good experience.
Valuable grounding.
And then eventually he lands at this small company in Seattle called Starbucks Coffee Company. But, and the sources are really clear on this was not the Starbucks we know now.
Not even close. Back then, it was all about roasting and selling high-quality coffee beans. That was it. Maybe some brewing equipment, some spices.
You walked in, bought your beans, maybe a filter cone, and left. No comfy chairs, no espresso machines hissing, no lattes.
None of that. The global phenomenon we see today. Still just a tiny flicker of an idea somewhere.
And that flicker, according to the sources, really ignited during a pivotal trip Schultz took to Milan, Italy back in 1983. This is almost always cited as the central aha moment for him.
It really seems to be. He wasn't just, checking out coffee shops. He was observing something entirely different. These places were vibrant, bustling, but also somehow intimate public spaces.
The sources use that term third places, don't they?
They do. That idea of a space that's not home, not work, but somewhere else where people gather. In Milan, these cafes weren't just pit stops for caffeine. They were social hubs.
Full of conversation, connection.
Community, all built around the ritual of coffee. It wasn't about the quick sale, it was the whole experience.
And that experience just hit him hard. He came back to the U.S. with this, well, almost audacious vision. He wanted to replicate that sense of community he'd seen in Italy.
Not just sell coffee, but create these welcoming spaces, these third places where people felt like they belonged, where they felt seen, valued. A sort of comfortable refuge between home and work.
And this concept, this vision, born from seeing Milan, but also, you've tense, deeply connected to his own background, his understanding of people needing connection and dignity. This became the absolute foundation for the Starbucks we know.
But, as the sources detail, turning that vision into reality, far from straightforward. He initially had a tough time convincing the original Starbucks owners.
They weren't keen on the espresso bar idea.
Not really. They were focused on the bean business. Schultz believed that the sort of theater of the espresso bar, the aroma, the interaction between the barista and customer, that was key to the experience he wanted to create. The owners hesitated.
Which led him to actually leave Starbucks for a bit.
Yeah, briefly. He started his own company, Il Giornale, modeled on those Italian espresso bars he loved. He had to raise the capital himself, prove the concept could actually work in the U.S., show that the third place idea wasn't just a European thing.
And then eventually he came back and bought Starbucks.
He did, in 1987. The price tag mentioned is $3.8 million. Seems almost unbelievably small now, considering.
Right. But back then, a huge risk, a massive undertaking to secure that funding.
Totally. And the sources really stressed that from the second he took over, his expansion strategy was fundamentally different. It wasn't just about finding good locations and crunching demographic numbers.
It was about the culture from day one.
Exactly. The core belief, which the sources explicitly link back to his upbringing, his father's experience, was that leadership couldn't just be about selling coffee or maximizing profit. It had to be tied to elevating the dignity of the people serving the coffee, the baristas, the managers, and at the same time creating that sense of belonging for the customers.
So that people-first approach wasn't some later add-on, like a PR move.
No, the sources show it was baked in from the very beginning, right from that purchase in '87. It was the DNA of the company he wanted to build.
Which leads us perfectly into what the sources call the revolutionary concept of human-centered leadership.
Yeah, and they describe his philosophy as, on a surface, pretty simple, but actually revolutionary for its time and especially for that industry, basically. Treat your people with profound dignity and respect and make that the absolute foundation for everything else.
It almost sounds, well, maybe a bit obvious now. Treat people well.
It can sound that way, yeah. But the sources give the context that makes it revolutionary. Think about the retail and food service world, especially back then. High turnover, often low wages.
Very transactional. Employees seen as easily replaceable.
Right. Schultz deliberately pushed against that. The sources detail that conscious decision to call everyone working in the stores and plants partners, not employees.
And that wasn't just semantics.
No, not just a word game. It was meant to signal that they were integral, that they were vested stakeholders in the brand, in the customer experience, in the culture itself. They weren't just labor. They were partners carrying the whole thing forward.
And he backed that up with concrete actions, tangible benefits.
Absolutely. Industry-leading benefits, way ahead of competitors, and crucially, extended to part-time workers too. The sources highlight that really groundbreaking move in 1988, just a year after he bought the company.
Which was?
Introducing comprehensive healthcare coverage for every employee working at least 20 hours a week.
Wow, 1988. For part-timers in food service, that must have been unheard of.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And the sources strongly suggest this was a direct echo of seeing his family lose their health care when his dad got hurt. It wasn't just a line item cost. It was an investment in preventing that same vulnerability for his own people, his partners. It showed a real commitment to their well-being beyond just their work hours.
A powerful statement.
Definitely. And the investment didn't stop with healthcare. In 1991, the sources talk about the launch of the Beanstalk program.
Right, the stock options.
Yeah, but crucially, offering equity, actual company stock, to every single partner, from the barista right up to the store manager. Not just for the execs, ownership for everyone.
And the thinking behind that.
The sources quote Schultz believing that if you give people a real stake in the outcome, they start to think and act like owners. They invest their heart, not just their hands. They become personally invested because the company's success directly impacts their own future.
Makes sense. And then there's the education piece, which the sources cover extensively.
Yeah, the Starbucks College Achievement Plan, that came later, launched in 2014 in partnership with Arizona State University, ASU.
And the deal was?
Full tuition coverage for eligible U.S. partners to earn an online bachelor's degree through ASU.
Full tuition. That's huge.
Massive. And it wasn't some tiny pilot program either. The sources cite the scale. By 2023, over 10,000 partners had actually graduated through this program.
10,000 people getting degrees they might not have otherwise afforded.
Exactly. Think about the impact on those individuals, their families. It's presented in the sources as this powerful commitment to empowering partners, helping them grow personally and professionally, cementing that idea that Starbucks was invested in them as whole people, not just workers.
Beyond these big programs, the sources also highlight his leadership style, his presence.
Yeah, his commitment to listening. They describe how he would regularly, almost relentlessly, visit stores. Not just the fancy flying ship ones, but average stores, sometimes showing up unannounced.
And talk to the baristas directly.
Talk with them, not inspecting, not lecturing, asking questions. What do you need? What could be better? What are customers saying? What are your daily struggles?
That feels very much like servant leadership, doesn't it? Being on the ground.
Totally. It's the opposite of being detached in some corporate tower. Being present, showing genuine interest, actually paying attention, and then, importantly, responding with empathy. The sources suggest that empowered thousands of partners, made them feel seen, heard, supported, like their insights actually mattered to the guy running the whole show.
It all seems to circle back to that idea of purpose he talked about.
It does. The sources feature that quote, "When you're surrounded by people who share a passionate commitment around a common purpose, anything is possible."
And that purpose, they emphasize, was never just about selling more coffee or opening more stores.
No, it was defined as to nurture the human spirit, one cup, one person, one neighborhood at a time, which is, well, it's an incredibly ambitious, deeply human mission statement, isn't it? Way bigger than just serving coffee.
Absolutely. But pursuing a mission that big, especially while growing at warp speed globally, that's bound to lead to challenges, right? Times when that mission gets really tested.
Oh, definitely. And the sources go into detail about one such period, a really critical one. Which brings us to how Schultz navigated what sounds like it could have been an existential crisis. Let's call this part, navigating crisis and reclaiming soul.
Okay.
The sources pinpoint a major turning point around 2008. By then, Starbucks had grown incredibly fast, maybe too fast.
The focus shifted.
It seems so. The sources suggest that the relentless focus on rapid growth had led to a kind of dilution of quality, and maybe more importantly, a fading of the brand's core essence, its soul, as Schultz himself apparently described
And
it.
people noted it.
Customers certainly did. The sources cite feedback piling up the coffee just didn't taste the same anymore, which is pretty fundamental for a coffee company.
You'd think.
Yeah. Baristas felt rushed. The focus seemed to be shifting from that human connection to just getting through the line faster. The whole experience started feeling more, well, corporate, losing that unique third-place warmth.
And Schultz wasn't CEO at this point.
No, he'd actually stepped down from the CEO role back in 2000, moved to chairman, focused more on global strategy. But the sources describe him watching from the sidelines as the company seemed to drift. He saw the quality slipping, the culture eroding.
And he came back.
He did. In 2008, right as the global financial crisis was really hitting hard, he made the tough decision to return as CEO. Felt this profound responsibility, apparently. And when he came back, he made a decision that the sources describe as almost, well, unthinkable in the corporate world at the time.
This is the famous store shutdown.
That's the one, the now legendary moment. Schultz decided to shut down every single Starbucks store across the entire United States, 7 to 100 locations, for a full evening, February 26, 2008.
Why? What was the goal?
To retrain every single barista on the fundamentals, the precise art of pulling the perfect espresso shot. It wasn't a PR stunt. It was this massive, simultaneous recommitment to core product quality.
The logistics must have been insane.
Immense, coordinating thousands of stores, hundreds of thousands of partners, and the cost. The sources estimate an immediate hit of around $6 million in lost sales just for that one evening.
$6 million during a financial crisis.
Exactly.
Okay.
But Schultz, as quoted in the material, didn't see it as a cost. He framed it as an essential, non-negotiable investment in the company's values and the quality that built the brand. It sent this incredibly powerful message both inside and outside the company. Quality and craft come first. We will not sacrifice them for speed or scale, even when times are tough.
That's a bold move.
Incredibly bold. And that shutdown wasn't just a one-off gesture. The sources describe it as the spark for a much broader systemic reset across the company.
What else did they do?
They cut hundreds of stores that were underperforming or maybe in poor locations to refocus energy and resources. They completely revamped training programs, not just on espresso, but reinforcing that customer connection piece. They improved sourcing practices even more. And interestingly, they redesigned the espresso machines.
Redesign the machines? Why?
The sources note that some of the earlier automations had made pulling a shot too detached, too mechanical. They wanted to bring back some of the tactile, human element to the craft, reinforcing the barista's role as a skilled artisan, not just a button pusher.
Interesting detail. And how did Schultz lead internally during this tough time?
The sources really highlight his approach here, leading with humility and transparency. He didn't just issue orders from Seattle. He held open forums with partners all over the country, traveled constantly,
And invited feedback.
actively invited tough, sometimes really uncomfortable feedback. The sources quote him directly asking things like, "What are we doing wrong? What does Starbucks really stand for now? How did we lose our way?"
Wow. Asking those questions when things are going badly takes guts. Welcoming criticism.
Immense courage and self-awareness. The sources emphasize he genuinely wanted to hear it, believing that facing those uncomfortable truths head-on was absolutely essential to rebuild trust internally and figure out the right path forward based on reality, not just wishful thinking.
And externally, what was the message?
The focus shifted squarely back to the fundamentals. The sources describe a conscious effort to return to authentic coffee experiences, fostering genuine customer relationships, moving away from that transactional feel.
So less discounting.
Yeah, rejecting aggressive promotions that kind of cheapen the brand, instead focusing on elevating the atmosphere in the stores, the quality of the coffee itself, and deepening that engagement between partners and customers. The mantra became making every single cup count. Quality of drink, warmth of interaction over just speed and volume.
And did it work? What was the outcome?
According to the sources, it was transformative. By confronting the crisis with transparency, humility, and these really decisive actions that prioritize culture and quality even at significant cost, Schultz managed to steer Starbucks back. The brand was rejuvenated, the culture felt revitalized, the connection with customers was reaffirmed.
So the big takeaway from that period.
The sources really frame it as true leadership demands the courage to stop, to really reflect, and to decisively realign when you've gone off course. And maybe even more profoundly, that a company's culture, its true values, aren't really tested when things are easy. It's in those moments of deep crisis that you find out what you're really made of.
That makes a lot of sense. And this focus on culture, on values, on the human side, it wasn't just internal, right? It extended outwards.
Absolutely. It shaped how Starbucks positioned itself in the wider world. The sources explore this under the theme of business as a global citizen, purpose, and conscience. It starts with reiterating that foundational idea of the stores as third places. Remember, welcoming community hubs, not just places to buy stuff. And that whole environment, that feeling of welcome, was built on a framework of corporate values.
And one of the biggest ways those values showed up globally was ethical sourcing. The sources really detail that.
They do. Schultz pushed Starbucks to be a leader here with their CAFE practices, coffee and farmer equity guidelines.
CAFE practices, what did that actually involve?
Well, they're presented not just as simple guidelines, but as this comprehensive verification program developed with Conservation International, actually. And it goes way beyond just paying a fair price.
How so?
The sources explain CAFE practices evaluate farms and mills on 4 key areas. Product quality, obviously, economic accountability, so transparency in payments down the chain, social
It
responsibility,
includes?
fair labor standards, safe working conditions, importantly, no child labor. And fourth, environmental leadership, things like conservation efforts, waste management, protecting water quality.
That sounds pretty thorough, and they implemented this at scale.
Huge scale. The sources highlight the numbers. By 2009, over 65% of their coffee was ethically sourced under these strict guidelines. By 2015, that figure hit nearly 99%.
99% for a company that big.
Almost unheard of globally. It was, and still is, incredibly ambitious.
And the why behind this? The sources link it back to Schultz's core philosophy.
Directly. His belief, as presented, was that a single cup of coffee should ideally uplift everyone it touches. From the farmer growing the bean thousands of miles away to the partner brewing it, right through to the customer enjoying it, creating this positive ripple effect.
Not just extracting value, but adding it back.
Exactly. And that led to real investment in those coffee-growing communities. The sources detail Starbucks putting money into farmer support centers, places in Latin America, Africa, Asia offering resources, training on sustainable farming, access to better seedlings, help improving quality and yield.
So active partnerships, not just buying beans.
Right. They also invested in developing climate-resilient coffee varieties, helping farmers adapt to environmental changes. It was about long-term sustainability, not just short-term supply.
And the social commitments went beyond just the coffee itself.
Yeah, much broader. The sources detail various hiring initiatives targeting specific groups who often face barriers: military veterans and their spouses, young people, refugees. These weren't just token gestures. The sources suggest there were real efforts to use Starbucks' scale to provide opportunity.
Any other examples?
Food share extensions mentioned the program donating unsold food to food banks apparently resulted in millions of meals. And the sources touch on environmental efforts too, like phasing out plastic straws, piloting reusable cup systems, a broader sense of responsibility.
And then there was the Race Together campaign. That definitely stirred things up.
It absolutely did. 2015. The sources describe the initiative. Baristas were encouraged, briefly, to write "Race Together" on cups and try to spark conversations with customers about racial inequality during a time of heightened tension in the U.S.
Yeah, I remember the reaction. It was mixed, to say the least.
Very mixed. The sources acknowledge the significant backlash. Criticism about the timing, whether it was appropriate for a coffee company, the potential burden on baristas.
All valid points raised at the time.
For sure. But the sources also highlight Schultz's resolve behind it. They present his underlying belief that a major company shouldn't be a bystander on critical social issues, that it had a responsibility, maybe even an obligation, to use its platform to stimulate difficult dialogues, even if it was uncomfortable.
A bold move, regardless of the outcome.
Definitely bold, and maybe a bit controversial. But it fits that pattern of trying to lead on social matters.
And all these different initiatives, this whole philosophy, it seems to boil down to that one quote the sources keep bringing up.
The people business one.
Yeah. We are not in the coffee business serving people. We are in the people business serving coffee.
That really does seem to capture it, doesn't it? It's presented as the key differentiator, the thing that aimed to make Starbucks more than just a global chain, but a kind of global citizen, framing corporate responsibility not as some optional extra, but as core strategy, baked into how they source, treat employees, engage communities, respond to issues.
Okay, so stepping back from the big picture strategy and the global stage, the sources also give us some glimpses into the sort of daily habits and personal qualities that drove Schultz's leadership.
Right, which brings us to something like the habits of a servant leader, discipline and self-awareness.
How do the sources describe him on a day-to-day level?
Consistently as an intense doer. Very hands-on, incredibly disciplined personally.
Like the famous early emails?
Exactly, mentioning him routinely sending emails at 5 a.m. And his focus wasn't just high-level stuff then. The sources say he'd often be digging into detailed store-level reports, customer feedback, partner suggestions.
Your real eye for detail.
Famously sharp eye. Noticing everything from, the music playing in a store to the exact texture of the foam on a cappuccino. The sources acknowledge this style could be intense, maybe perceived as micromanagement sometimes, but they emphasize it came from this deep passion and genuine care for the brand, for the quality, for the experience at every single touch point. He wanted it right.
But alongside that intensity, the sources also talk about self-awareness.
Yeah, this is important. They highlight that he evolved. He apparently admitted himself that he had a tendency to micromanage, especially when things were tough, driven by that desire for everything to be perfect.
But he learned.
That's the key point the sources make. It was a learning process. They describe it as a humbling evolution, something he talked about openly. He learned to gradually step back more, to really trust the capable team around him, to create space for others to lead.
That willingness to admit flaws and adapt is pretty crucial for any leader, isn't it?
Absolutely. And it reinforces that view of leadership the sources keep coming back to. Leadership not as control, but as service.
Tied back to his roots again.
Explicitly. Explaining how that working-class background gave him this deep respect for the dignity of all work, especially those tough, often overlooked jobs. He understood the pride people take, but also their vulnerability. And that understanding informed so many decisions, from benefits to store design.
And that idea of sharing success.
Yeah, encapsulated in another quote, the sources feature. Success is best when it's shared. The sources argue this wasn't just talk. It drove the creation of those systems at Starbucks, aimed at partner growth, financial, educational, even personal, like adding mental health care benefits.
So these programs weren't just perks, they were strategic.
Exactly. Framed as culture-maximizing investment. Yeah. They built loyalty, engagement, performance long-term, even if they didn't always look like the most profit-maximizing choice on a quarterly report.
And he led by example. How so?
Well, the sources point to his practice of listening before jumping in. Those global store visits, not just PR fluff, but real opportunities for connection, for understanding the front lines. His belief seemed to be that simply showing up, being present, talking to people, that is powerful leadership.
It's interesting how the habits described aren't necessarily flashy.
Not at all. They're consistent, grounded, fundamentally human things. Waking early, reading the details, talking to people, paying attention. And the sources consistently suggest that in a high-stakes world of global business, it was precisely this commitment to the consistent human stuff that made the difference.
Okay, so as we sort of pull all these threads together, bringing this deep dive towards a close, we land on the enduring lessons of Schultz's approach.
Yeah, synthesizing all this info from the sources. And the cumulative case they make is pretty compelling. That Howard Schultz built more than just a successful company, he built a genuine philosophy of business.
One that really challenged the norms of the time.
Absolutely. Challenge that idea that businesses must prioritize short-term profits above everything, that you have to cut corners on people or quality to achieve scale.
He kind of proved the opposite.
He demonstrated, through Starbucks' incredible growth and resilience, that putting people first, your partners, customers, communities, isn't just a nice-to-have or a cost. It's actually a profound competitive advantage. The sources really hammer this home. For Schultz, empathy and ambition weren't opposites. They could and maybe should work together. Building that strong, values-driven culture was just as vital as having a great product.
So what are the key lessons the sources seem to offer up for you, the listener? Let's try and recap them.
Okay, first, and maybe the most central, treat people like genuine partners, not just resources to be used up. That big investment in healthcare, stock options, education, it wasn't just charity. The sources frame it as deeply strategic. Respect, security, investment that drives engagement, loyalty, purpose.
Right. Second lesson, don't be afraid to hit pause and fundamentally reset when needed. That huge 2008 store shutdown.
Costly, but courageous.
Exactly. It showed that protecting core values, the brand's soul, mattered more than the immediate numbers. It takes guts, especially in a crisis, but it can be essential for long-term health.
Third lesson, let your business, or whatever you're building, serve a broader mission than just profit. Schultz didn't duck complex social issues, race, mental health, veterans, education. The sources suggest great companies don't just stay silent. They find ways to lead, contribute, use their platform responsibly.
Okay. Fourth,
stay connected to the ground. No matter how big Starbucks got, the sources show Schultz kept trying to connect with the front lines. Leadership needs that active, humble listening, asking tough questions, hearing the real answers, not just being the loudest voice. Those store visits embodied that.
Makes sense. And the last one.
Lead with both heart and discipline. Schultz's story, as told here, is a reminder that success isn't just about background or connections. It's often built by sheer integrity, consistent effort, those 5 a.m. emails, attention to detail, and never forgetting where you came from. Plus, that willingness to admit mistakes and evolve, that's crucial too.
It really does all come back to that core idea, doesn't it?
Yeah, as the source material reinforces again and again.
Yeah.
Despite all the talk about coffee, expansion, revenue, market share, Fundamentally, business isn't really about any of those things.
It's about people.
Ultimately, yes, it's about people.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the source material on Howard Schultz's leadership, let's bring it back to you listening. What aspect of this story really resonated most with you? Was it that deep connection he made between his own past and his corporate choices, that foundation of empathy?
Or maybe the sheer boldness of those decisions in crisis, like the store shutdown. Was it the big vision of turning coffee into this community movement?
Or perhaps it was those quieter habits, the discipline, the attention to detail, the hard-won self-awareness in his leadership style.
Take a moment to think about how these lessons, drawn specifically from the sources we looked at, might apply in your own world, whether you're leading a team, building something new, or just navigating your daily work and interactions.
How does that idea of genuinely putting people first, staying true to your core values, leading with purpose and discipline, how might that show up for you?
The sources we explored today strongly suggest that for Starbucks under Schultz, corporate responsibility wasn't just a side project or PR. It was framed as the core strategy, the bedrock of sustainable success, because it built the culture.
And they suggest that the real strength of any culture, a company, a team, even a family, isn't obvious when things are easy. It's truly revealed when it's tested by tough times, like that 2008 crisis.
Which leaves us with maybe one final provocative thought to mull over, stemming directly from that recurring phrase in the sources, being in the people business serving coffee.
If you really take that mindset to heart, what are the deepest practical implications? What does it fundamentally demand from any organization, big or small, or even from us in our personal lives?
What does it really mean to try and nurture the human spirit in the spaces we create and influence, moving beyond just saying it to actually doing it consistently?
Something to think about as you go about your day.